Welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. You may have noticed in recent weeks we've had other hosts in this chair. It was a huge mistake of mine to ask Ruth and Neil to host Talking Absolute Worship, because now it means I'm going to have to up my game. I've surrounded myself today with some of the most dazzling lectionary preachers, and so I'm also going to have to up my game. We're welcoming Lithan and Robert and Peter as we talk about Epiphany 7. Lithan is very excited about Epiphany 7, so I'm going to let her go first. Lithan, where do you think you're going with your preaching this week?
I suppose the thing that's exciting, I don't know if exciting might be too strong a word, about Epiphany 7 is because we very rarely get to Epiphany 7. We've got an extra long gap between Christmas and Lent this year, which I guess means that Easter's going to be quite late. So that means we get to do some of the bits that we don't normally have in the lectionary. When I look back on my preaching, I very, very rarely had Epiphany 7. We quite often will get up to maybe 4 or 5, but not 7. So there's that. However, I think 3 of the readings are really good. I'm not going to talk about 1 Corinthians 15. I studied that for my O-levels last century, and I'm not sure I understood it then. It's all about what the resurrection of the body is like. And I'd say it might be something that will be fruitful with a particular congregation, but it's also one that you have to be very careful about pastorally. Perhaps if you're someone who preaches in the same church every week, that will be one to go for. But if you're like me, an itinerant preacher, you never quite know what the situation will be. And talking all about death and resurrection and what the body's going to be like, you'd need to be quite careful about. So I'm not going to do that one.
I suspect you're not the only one, Nathan, who's not going to do that one. But Peter will be bringing up the rear and will hoover up any passages that we haven't covered, I'm sure.
So it's probably no surprise that I will either wholly focus on Luke or Luke with a bit of Genesis. And I'm not sure which way round I'd start. So as I haven't really thought that through, I'm going to start with Luke. And Luke is part of what's known as the Sermon on the Plain, which, like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, Jesus just says loads of stuff, and he doesn't preach in a way in these two. The sermons he does don't have quite as many story illustrations. So they do have a lot of word pictures in them, but it's still quite hard to just sit and listen to these verses, these 11 verses, and remember the beginning when you've got to the end. Or you might remember 1 or 2 of the eye-catching word pictures, but it might just be me, but it kind of ends up in a bit of a word mush. It just says love everybody, and and the problem with that word mush, where we go, yeah, because loving everybody is lovely, and loving is what we need to do, and we're lovely, and we'll love people because they're lovely, and that's really not what this is about. This is about radical loving people and how hard it is. And I think so that's where it's important to remind people that when we talk about relationships, it's not soft stuff, it's quite tough. And one of the problems of the church historically is that we felt that we're good at this this stuff because it's soft stuff and it's easy, and actually we've behaved appallingly to people in the name of love. And I think we need to acknowledge some of that in what we do, that we haven't really heard and lived out what Jesus is saying. And so what I might do, rather than kind of just then go through each one, because again 11 examples is too many, but so I might either invite people to pick one, or perhaps even more sneakily give people out one of the verses for them to reflect on, perhaps in a small group, to say, what does this actually mean to live this out? Because there's a lot of countercultural stuff here about turning the other cheek. So I read from Spill the Beans, it reminded me that that I think it would be a backhand that on one cheek, and then to do the other cheek actually means the person hitting you, if it was a master slave thing, the master would lose status by hitting the other way. So actually by offering more lovingly, you're making a stand in a different way. And also, if you give away your coat, that's one thing. But if it's your shirt, and then remembering in Jesus' time, it's not coat, shirt, vest necessarily, trousers and pants. It's kind of, your shirt could be the equivalent of your undies. So actually what you're saying is, you don't just do a small thing, you're willing to risk being totally humiliated and embarrassed in order to help someone out. Or when you're forced to give, you do more than is expected, because that's going to surprise people. But all of that, we then need to focus on, what's the bit in the middle, where it says, that's right, verse 35, love your enemies, do good, lend, expecting nothing in return. And that might just be about lending, expecting nothing in return. Is really giving, isn't it? But I suppose it's allowing someone to say, I'm lending this to you, can make them feel better. And I guess the expecting nothing in return is mostly about the lending. I think it could apply to all of this loving. You're not supposed to do that to get anything in return. It's not supposed to be that you'll end up feeling good, or even bringing people to Christ, or growing your church, perhaps. What Jesus is calling us to do is just love and love and love, even if it's really tough, because if we lived this out, it would be really tough. And that's where, going on to the Genesis reading, which is about forgiveness, which is equally tough. And I ordered a book that hasn't arrived. So I ordered the book of Desmond Tutu's Reworking of the Bible for Children. And at the end of each Bible story, there's a really short prayer. And in the story of Joseph, he ends it with, "Dear God, let my love be stronger than my anger." And I think that's kind of where it fits in, that's how loving should be, stronger than our anger, and maybe stronger than all sorts of other emotions that we might be feeling. And I was just reflecting this morning that in the Genesis reading, Joseph is saying, it's God did all of this. God made me, gave me this position so that I in turn could be in a position to help you and help you have forgiveness. I do love the way that Joseph still has to do something a bit sneaky and tricky before that. But if he's not willing to work with God in the forgiveness, then that would never have happened. So yes, it is up to God, but there is a part that we have to play, and that really is asking God to help us let our love be stronger than our anger, because sometimes that's harder than we think it is.
Yeah, thank you, Lithan. I suspect many preachers will have gone in the same direction. I certainly was, to pick up the theme of Genesis and Joseph's response to his brothers, and Jesus teaching about how you respond to your enemies. I was a little bit intrigued reading Luke 6 again. There does seem to be a little tiny bit of internal conflict. I'm not 100% sure how to deal with, and that is that the verse that you point out, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Which is, plain. You shouldn't give expecting a reward. But then the very last verse says, "A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back." And it kind of suggests that the motivation for doing that is because we'll get a reward in heaven, which seems to then counteract what was said earlier on. I don't know, maybe we could just leave the last sentence off and pretend nobody's heard it. But I was kind of all for it. And then I got distracted by that sentence, and I haven't really got an explanation for it other than, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a little bit of Luke sneaking in to sort of soften what Jesus is saying. I don't know. What maybe we're all tempted to soften what Jesus says sometimes. With these hard words, we say, yeah, but it doesn't really mean it exactly. It's not literal. And we soften it around the edges a bit, don't we, to sort of lessen its radical impact. But yeah, I think that connection is a plain one. How do we respond to conflict and adversity and opposition and hatred and bitterness directed at us in the world? And Luke and you are suggesting there's a countercultural way of doing that, which kind of is countercultural, isn't it? It would be seen as weakness by some people. And again, I think you're suggesting that some of these passages need to be preached cautiously. I always think Luke 6 is something that needs to be preached cautiously, because you never know who's in the congregation. Hopefully you know some of the people, but you don't always know who's in the congregation and what conflict and potentially abuse they're currently facing. That Jesus is, I'm sure, not saying to somebody who's subject to domestic abuse that they should just take it and offer their other cheek. That kind of needs some unpacking, doesn't it? Somewhere in that, how that works. But it's often, actually I've done it now, but it often strikes me that when people read this passage, we leap straight to the most extreme example, don't we? And we say, well, what if? And I just did. What if? And then it's easy to dismiss. Whereas I think, whilst Jesus is talking about extreme examples, crucifixion being one, 99% of the power of this passage is going to be in everyday encounters that we have, not in extreme examples. And that's where this passage is going to make the real difference in our lives. I think general day-to-day responding to hatred, bitterness, greed, anger, opposition, sheer nastiness, whatever it is, how we respond makes a difference in the world. So yeah, I think I'd probably be setting off in that direction. I don't know about you, Robert. Which direction were you looking to set off in?
Well, I'm all over the place now. I struggle with this because I think the danger is that it reads a bit like a bully's charter, that whatever anybody does to me, I've just got to smile slightly and get on with it. And it reminds me of those, the olden days when the rich would tell people, oh, don't worry about how you're treated here because you'll get your reward in heaven. That whole sort of thing speaks to me, and the idea of standing for what you believe. But the bit that struck me as being countercultural really is that everything in our society is transactional. So if I do that for you, you'll do that for me. And it seems to me what this is saying is, no, that isn't the way. So rather than it being about backing down in every situation, it is about the fact that you shouldn't always be looking for what you can gain from any situation. And I thought the example that Lethan gave about bringing people to Christ is the sort of classic for me, because you hear about churches putting on all sorts of social things. My last church, we did our work club, and I remember people saying, but nobody comes to church, because of it. And you think, is that why we do it? And I remember that when I wasn't a Christian, one of the things that put me off Christians was the fact that everything they did for you seemed to have a subtext, the idea, I'll do this if you come to church, I'll do this. So it was completely transactional, and I think I'm using the right word, and completely cultural. And I think for me, what this all seems to be saying, and I like what you said, Phil, about it not being in the big stuff about crucifixion, but in the everyday, when you let somebody through the door first or into that parking space, or you just do things for people without thinking, what am I getting back? That isn't part of the deal. And a simple example of that is that when I was a young man and had mates, friends, we were at art school together, we never bought each other birthday presents, and we never sent birthday cards or anything like that. It just wasn't part of the thing. But when you went to the pub, somebody got money and they'd buy the drinks, and then the next time you went to the pub, somebody else had, and it wasn't transactional. And I always remember the first time going out with girls, then they had all this thing about you've got to get them a present for the birthday, and I think, well, why? Well, and it's because they won't be your friend, and it all became. And you think, well, why are you buying? You're not buying these things because you like the person, you know, the Secret Santa and all that sort of thing. So it's something about moving away from that transactional thing. Sorry,
you're saying that girls ruin everything, Robert. Is
yeah, absolutely. Oh dear. And the Psalms name, do not fret because of the wicked, do not be envious of wrongdoers. And I think, yeah, that all works. But if I think of some of the situations I've been in, you know, as usually with me, it's remembering some horrible job I had when I was young with some awful boss who treated me rotten. And it's very difficult to turn the other, or well, you have to turn the other cheek or you get the sack sort of thing. But yeah, it just feels that if you're not careful, it could be a charter for bullies. That's my sort of discomfort with it. And Genesis, in a way, this whole thing that all this terrible stuff happens to Joseph, and then it's all wonderful, and then his brothers come, and he goes, "Oh, well, it's nothing to do. It's all God, you know." And you think, well, is God that manipulative? So I'm not being very positive this morning, am I? So I think what I came to in the end, because I really struggle with this, was that I think what I wondered, is it that because on a sort of similar vein, there are these people who say, well, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and we needed a new car, and then I got up one morning and £10,000 had been stuffed through my letterbox. Isn't God good? And I think, hang on, that's transactional. It seems, I wonder, and I don't know where this came from in all this, if we want to see God at work in obvious ways, and we want to think of this sort of thing like the crucifixion, or if I'm nice to you, you'll be nice to me. And I began to think, is the way God works with us in such a tiny way, almost like roots growing underground, that we can't see what's going on, but it still is. It's God is at work. So even when we're in a situation where we think, have I got to turn the other cheek, that in the end that still is the right way. But then, you know, as you say, if somebody's been abused, that isn't the right thing to tell them, is it?
Thank you, Robert. I don't know. I think you're dead right to puzzle over these texts. I puzzled over the Genesis text, and often have, and it kind of links into the Psalm as well. There's definitely an idea in there that Joseph is putting forward, that all this stuff happened, and it's quite a catalogue of stuff. All this stuff happened because God had this plan. So it was all planned by God. And you kind of think, and if you kind of stop for a second, you think, hang on, so God saw in the future there was a drought coming. So his response was to make Joseph's brothers hate him, throw him in a pit, try to have him eaten by lions, or rather take his bloodied clothes back to his father, sell him into slavery, and he was then thrown into prison, and that's God's plan for dealing with a famine. Couldn't God just say, well, I tell you what, I'll make it rain, which would be a much easier response. So I kind of chime with you, that's kind of a bit manipulative. So I wrestled with this a bit this week, and I wonder, this is an I wonder question, which is trendy nowadays, isn't it? I wonder. I wonder whether this feeling that Joseph is putting forward, and the psalmist does, you know, trust in him and he will act. He will make your vindication shine like the light. Whether when we say that kind of stuff, when we say we can see God at work in adversity and darkness, when we say that, you know, that there's a reason for it all, I wonder whether actually it's really just about how we respond to adversity. And in our response, we're understanding something about God. And so Joseph responding in this way is understanding something about God. It's not that God has planned this all, event after event, and it was in God's diary that today Joseph gets kidnapped or Joseph gets sold into slavery. But Joseph is acting in a way that gives him insight and understanding into who God is, and that's this discovery that Joseph has made about God. I don't know. It's a question in my head. Listen.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say. That I think this is Joseph reflecting theologically. Which, so he'd make a good student at Westminster College, because that's what you're kind of supposed to do. Is you know, where was God in all this? And the phrase, which I am not a good student because I can never remember where it comes from, where it says, you know, God works in all things for good. And for me, that's what Joseph can be looking back and saying, and that was kind of why I wanted to talk about Joseph had to actively forgive his brothers, otherwise none of this could have happened. I think his brothers also, God saw the enmity that was created in his brothers by the absolute favoritism that the father gave, that caused a problem, and God found a way to work in that for good. And what happened to send Joseph into prison, I don't think that was God's intent, was to give Potiphar's wife a lustful eye, but God worked through that and made a good situation. And hopefully, you know, maybe Joseph just did go, well, I look back now and I think it was all God's plan to start with, but I think I'd probably put it in a more nuanced way and say that he can see now how God has been able to work for good in all of these difficult situations.
Yeah. So when we learn to respond to hatred with grace or forgiveness or humility or hope, then God is at work. Maybe, I don't know. That's as far as I can grasp, because I'm still reluctant to say, yeah, Joseph was right. God had planned this all along, and I just think that's it. It's a road to endless questions that are not very satisfying to me. Yeah, Robert.
I think I always say this, but it seems to me, well, it comes back to the thing that as I always say, is remembering my life without faith, and this sense of emptiness and hopelessness in some of those jobs I've talked to you about. That I think what I take from it is that even if things are happening that I don't understand, still the only hope is to hold on to God. And there's something about this in there that you do these things because you believe they're right. And good things and bad things might happen, but you still forgive because you believe that's the way God wants you to be, and you hope that in some way you can't understand, because I think, you know, because God's so much that we can't understand, no matter how hard we try, you believe and hope and trust that God is at work within it somewhere, and you hold on to that, you know, like reaching out for the hand in the darkness sort of thing.
Yeah, and maybe that is what's going on with Joseph, is that he's not had a great time until this sort of recent elevation to power and influence. And maybe through all that time, there's only one thing he could hold on to, saying, so something good's got to come out of this. And as soon as he sees it, he grasps it with both hands and says, see, God planned this all along and everything's fine. Maybe that's just his way of coping with the years of pain and hardship. Yeah, Robert.
I don't even think it's that something good's got to come out of it. I think the fact that the only thing I can do is hold on to my faith. And hope. Yeah. Something good may not come out, but what else do I do? That's what it seems to me.
there's a little tiny part. I don't know if you're allowed to think this, but there's a little tiny part in my head that kind of thinks at the beginning of the story of Joseph that he kind of had it coming. I mean, he was. He's not painted that sympathetically, is he? With his sort of like "I'm better than you" attitude to life. And I wonder whether there's also part of maybe there's a transformation in who Joseph is. I'm fairly sure that the Bible isn't asking us to think that, but this is a different Joseph than the one we're presented with at the beginning of his story, who seems to think that it's really important that he's lording it over them. But this is a very different kind of a Joseph. This is his like Saul, Paul moment, maybe on the road to whatever the equivalent of Damascus is in Egypt in those days. I don't know. Anyway, so we've basically covered Luke and Genesis and Psalm. There's nothing else to say about those. So, Peter, where do you think you're going with these readings this week?
Well, do you know, I'm going to pick up on Luke and Genesis. But
good plan.
I think listening and the way that we've been reflecting so far, it's just, these are really difficult passages. They aren't straightforward. They're not, you know, it's not this is what you do and this is the end result at all. And as I read through them, I thought, you know, this is really, really tough. But there's something in here about revealing God through our relationships. And that's, I think, the direction I'd head off in. I would start with Luke, and then I'd use the Genesis passage to have interaction with the congregation, get them into groups, get them thinking and talking through some of the application of what's being said in the Luke passage. But, you know, not wanting to repeat what any of you have already said, which is huge danger with passages like these. But it did occur to me, you know, as I was thinking about this, we're talking to ourselves as much as anyone else, because you can't help but read this and think, do you know, that's not how I've reacted in that situation, or would with this person, or that situation in church. And we've all done it, or I have. You may all be saintly and never have reacted to anyone, but that's not me. So I think the big questions here, how do we deal with those? If we're going to be honest with people in the congregation, I always think we should. How do we react to those that we don't like, we have a problem with, or even feel hate for? Who should we love? And then it led me to think, you know, if we follow our natural instincts as human beings, then the law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth that we read of in the Old Testament, actually we're going to have a whole society who are blind and toothless, which wouldn't be great, but that would be where we'd finish up, because, you know, that's the natural way of things. So there has to be a different way, and a way that actually works out better. And I think what this command to love your enemies really is doing is taking away the limits of who we consider to be friends and neighbours. So actually God's preaching about inclusive community, where we can't just say, well, these ones are in and these ones are out and these ones are the judged. Which we've all seen historical examples where, you know, you're a sinner, you're out, you didn't do this, and we just quote a verse of scripture at people and say, well, it says this, so you're on the outside and we're on the inside. What this is doing is saying, actually, none of us can actually say who's in and out, but it's how we relate to each other that's going to make the huge difference. But I think it's really important that we grapple with that for the modern day Christian, because the idea of removing privilege based on wealth or position, and the right to defend ourselves and respond to people based on that, is what's being played out across society and across the world, in terms of, you know, what we see as justice. And anyone who offends us, that's what shapes our culture. It's the wealthy and it's those in the positions of power who are playing that out. Therefore, the people we look to are highly unlikely to either be poor or non-violent people? And I think that's a big question. And hence the quest for material gain has increased dramatically, as has violence in our homes, which we've already touched on our streets. Drug wars are back in the news in a big, big way. And where has vaccine for COVID been the most successful? It's in the wealthier countries. So there's really big questions about where power and authority lie and who has that. And I think once we recognise that reality, then we can talk about there being here a better way. And that's the Jesus way, which has new attitudes and responses. And Jesus shows that oppression of the poor, materialism and presumption that problems can be solved by violence are all related. And we've got to go down a different path. So he calls us to respond in imaginative, but I think where Robert said earlier, this isn't about sitting back and just letting things happen to us and love everyone, it'll be all right. He's actually calling us to be proactive and to live a different way that's imaginative but non-violent, and finding new and imaginative ways to the problems of individual lives, of our local society, but also to the world. And we've all seen the bitter and painful fruit of living in a way that isn't the Jesus way. So then I think I'd just pick up then on the Joseph story and get people chatting, thinking about it. What happens if Joseph had followed the ways of the world? What happens to his family? What happens to the relationships? What's the future going to look like? And then what are the consequences of the way he does act? But then I think I'd want to concentrate a little bit on how much does this cost Joseph emotionally, as he sought to preserve his family's life in ways that corresponded to God's dealings with us. And it's a reminder of how costly our discipleship really is. So I think it's quite real, it's quite grounded, but it's actually life-changing. Because at the end of the day, as Robert said, we hang on to our faith even in the darkest days, and for me that's hugely significant. But it is life-changing, and I'd want prayer. I think this isn't a day that I just want to just roll on and roll through. I think we need to have space, because you're touching on really big things for people. And like Lithan, I might not even go down this path if I wasn't doing it at St Ives or Fen Stanton, which are congregations I know, because most of the time on a Sunday I'm somewhere that I don't have that relationship with. And I think you're touching on really big issues. But that's roughly where I'd be heading down, Phil.
Thank you, Peter. Disappointingly Corinthians light there. Lithan, you were going to say something a while ago.
Yeah, I thought I really loved what Peter was saying, and when Peter was talking about privilege in particular, I thought perhaps the challenge might be, although it's not exactly what Jesus is saying, but to turn it on the head and saying, how many times are we the one who's striking on the cheek, or demanding the coat, or to walk a mile? You know, because sometimes we are the Romans in this situation, because quite a lot of that is about the people that were in power, and what are we doing to those who are less powerful? And I think particularly at the moment, where for those who are white, understanding what privilege means that we've taken for granted is a really important thing. And these might be some verses that will just help us to start thinking about that. So thanks, Peter.
I think that's a question that is always worth asking. Where is the place that we instinctively place ourselves in this story? And pretty much all the time when we're reading Luke 6, we say, but what if they're attacking me? And rather than I'm the attacker, how do I respond when people people respond with love to me? It's just that would just be a really turning it on its head thing for most congregations who quite often, I think congregations will never have heard it preached from the perspective of the person who's doing the slapping or the backhanding. I'm with you, Peter, there on this whole this relates to this relates to me, and how do I treat people who are difficult and full of conflict in my own congregations. And I'm, as they say, on a journey, I think, in that I think I possibly shrugged off my most confrontational attitudes from my earlier days, where I just thought to be just bigger and louder than the opposition, which didn't really usually turn out well. And I'm kind of halfway there now. I'm probably at a point like when Jesus said, you know, love those who hate you, because then you're heaping burning coals on their head. So even in acting kindly to people, there's a part of my head that's still thinking, because they'll really hate it if I do that, because that'll make them feel bad. So I'm not doing it out the best of motives, because I know if I respond kindly to somebody who's clearly being awkward or difficult or ornery, then it gives me the moral high ground, which isn't the greatest motive, is it? But maybe it's just a stage on the journey. I've got plenty to learn and plenty of room to grow. I will have a go at Corinthians then, if nobody else is going to bite. I probably won't preach on Corinthians because it has a whole lot of other explanation to do, which is distracting then, isn't it? If you read it, you've got to deal with it. But I was taken by Paul's imagery about the sowing stuff, what you sow, and he kind of almost seems to be suggesting when the farmers are sowing, they've no idea what's going to come up, because it's God that gives the seed its body. And I mean, it's only a in passing reference and illustration, but I was thinking of my attitude to gardening. In all the gardens that I've had in the past, 90% of my gardening experience is clearing weeds and brambles, and I think it's because I have in my head this idea that what I need to start with is a completely blank canvas. I need to have a nice big bed that's completely empty of everything, and then I can start planting good stuff in it. And that never works. It just never works, because as soon as I've cleared it all, I think, oh, that's great. And then before I plant anything to survive in it, everything's grown back again, and the weeds are back the following year, and then I clear them again and think, right, I'll do it properly this time. Whereas I think there are different approaches, aren't they, to gardening, where you plant the stuff you want there in such abundant, overwhelming glory that it overshadows all the weeds and the thugs and everything else, and there's no room for the weeds, which is a completely different attitude to gardening. And maybe there's something of that in this Luke passage about how we respond to darkness and conflict in the world. It's not to spend our entire time opposing conflict and arguing with it and fighting it, and but to plant good stuff in the hope that will overwhelm the darkness. Yeah, Lithan.
So do you think you might be being called to love the weeds rather than just clear them out?
No, there's no chance. Bindweed, come on. Yeah, good point, but it doesn't apply to gardening. Not with bindweed.
I would be saying to you, Phil, if you can't stand weeds, don't garden.
Don't garden. That's
You're in the wrong place. Yeah.
A flower in the wrong place. Yeah, people say that, don't they? But yeah, when your garden's full of bindweed, I don't hear anyone saying that. Still, there we go. We're tiptoeing into illustrations, aren't we? So it might be a good point to change gear. We've stuffed your heads full of awesome preaching theme ideas. And while you're processing that, I'm going to have a quick go around the room to see if people have got other ideas about how we might bring these passages to life for our congregations. Lithan, what might you have in your bag?
Well, I would have the book of Bible stories read by Desmond Tutu, and so he's rewritten them, and you can also get an accompanying version of him reading them out, because I think my challenge would be not doing my impersonation.
Don't go there.
Because of you can just hear him kind of read all of those. But another one that I found somewhere was it is pebbles and water, which, you know, we use quite a lot, but the idea is to ask people to write with a washable pen the name of someone that they might class as their enemy on the pebble, to pray for them, and then wash the name off. And then you can decide if you think that the blessing that you've prayed for that person, if you think that's really at the moment going to enable you to have a kind of change of heart and relationship, to take the pebble away. But if you're not at that stage, to leave the pebble there. And I think that's quite an important thing, not to force people into forgiveness when they're not, they may be able to recognize, I've got a problem with this person and I want to make it right. You can go so far, but you might not be able to go all the way. And it is a process, forgiveness. And we need to be careful with that. And the other one that I thought of was, this is one that you'd need to prepare before the service, would be to ask people to give them one of the verses from Luke and ask them to either photograph it themselves or to find a picture to illustrate that verse. And I thought, especially if you've got a younger congregation, there might be people who could act out some of the verses, and just seeing people that doing that would be good. But for others, it might need to be just access to Pixabay or Unsplash, or just thinking a bit differently about how would I illustrate this verse when we share it together on the Sunday.
Thank you. I like the pebble idea, and I certainly warm to the advice about not putting people in a position where they have to instantly forgive because it's the service and the minister's told them to, but to give them that thought and that mechanism by which they can begin to reflect on it. And maybe you could tell them to put the pebble in their back pocket so that whenever they sit down, it reminds them of that lump in their lives that one day will need to be dealt with.
We all know what you're trying to say and are politely not saying it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sitting on 5 pebbles now. It's not comfortable. Yeah, or maybe don't. I don't know. But yeah, I like the idea that sometimes I think we do kind of almost hold congregations to ransom, don't we? So now we're going to write things on paper. I'm going to burn them all because they're all gone. And then people go home and say, well, it's not gone at all. It's still there. So I really warm to that. Thank you, Luthen. Robert, what would you attempt?
The things I was thinking about were to do with this all being a bit of a puzzle. So I wondered if you couldn't find I was thinking about tying up a boat, and you have those rings on the quayside that you tie the boat up to. And when you walk past, you'll generally see a sort of a great big knot of rope. So it's all a sort of mess and a puzzle. And so I thought that's what this feels like, but it's still tied to the ring, and the ring is like God that holds us, even though it's all a bit of a puzzle. And then the other illustration was, again, this sort of thing, which I think was what I was trying to think about with Corinthians, is about the things that are growing, even when we can't see them and we don't necessarily know what's going to come up. Somebody gave Gwen a lot of things to grow sprouts before Christmas, and she planted them on the allotment, and then when they came up, they weren't sprouts at all, which makes it I'm trying to remember what they were, but they definitely weren't sprouts.
Cannabis, Robert. It was cannabis.
Cannabis, sure. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. But this idea that stuff's going on that we can't know about, and it began to make me think of in what other ways is that the case. And I thought you could perhaps have a picture of a street of houses, and they're just all these houses that look the same, but inside each house there's a life or lives, and each of those lives are completely different. And if you walk down an anonymous street, you've got no idea what those lives are, but they are important. And something about that, or a cityscape, and just think of all that's going on. And this idea that God's working away, in the soil of our lives. even though we're not aware or in the soil or whatever, and there will be a result.
Yeah, cool. And with bindweed, you know what's going on with the soil. It's massive, long roots that you'll never get rid of. Yeah.
But, I mean, you keep on about bindweed, but wherever bindweed comes from, where we brought it from, you know, when we thought, oh, we'll take that plant back to England because it's pretty, there it wasn't a nightmare. It was okay. It's just we put
mine came from my mother's garden. When she gave me some plants, and my brother also had it from my mother's garden. So that's where it came from. Right. Yeah.
Treasured then.
Bindweed. Yes. Yeah, I like that, Robert. I like that. Peter, astonish us.
Yeah. Okay. I may not do that, but I'm going down the line of the coat, because I think it could be used for either passage. You could base the whole service around here. But what I really liked the idea of was actually wearing clothes for the service myself, or whoever's leading the service. And
relieved.
Yeah, I know. Catherine would agree. So I would then actually at some point in the service start to give away what I was wearing. So the jacket would come off and I'd give it to someone else and say, this isn't just for now, this is a keepsy, and if you don't want it, pass it on to somebody else, because your taste might not be the same as mine, but I just want to give it to you as a gift. And then I'd give a sweater away, and I'd actually all things that I was wearing that day, because I think it's more striking if you've actually just been wearing it while you're in the service and you give, and then you can open up the whole conversation. Because I think if I was going down the path of the Genesis story, you could go down the path of here, you know, Joseph's coat, jacket, whatever you want to call it, had been the cause of huge problems in his life. It caused jealousy, envy, resentment. But it isn't the end of the story, because of when he meets the family again. And you might want to just wholly develop that theme about why there were problems, how there were problems. You could base the whole service on that, really. And then about how do you get to this point where you have a different relationship. If you used it for the Luke story, I think we'd ask the question, what does it mean to give someone your coat? You know, doing more than society expects can be a sign of the extravagant love of God that's showered upon all of us each day. So how do, as a congregation, we show that love to our community day by day? So you could actually build a whole service around that, or just use it as an example and have people go away to really think about that. But I think if you gave away something you were wearing that day in the service, it just somehow would have more impact. So that would be my idea of doing something different with it.
And would you be off down the charity shop in the week before to buy a jacket and a jumper especially, or this is going to be Peter's genuine jacket?
I think I'd try. I mean, I did think about going down the charity shop first, and then I thought, no, that lessens. If this is a jacket that people have seen me in and leading worship in that congregation over a period, and I genuinely give it away,
fantastic.
That is far more powerful for me as an individual to think about, and it's far more powerful for them.
And in the winter, everybody in the congregation will have a coat with them, won't they?
Yeah.
You could then invite people to donate their coats to a winter homeless charity there and then, as you go out.
I did actually think, you know, given the time of year we're in,
yeah,
it really could be significant, because people will have coat or jacket on.
Yeah.
So
does anyone want to give their coat this morning now?
Yeah.
And I will take them down to the homeless coats charity.
Yeah.
That's something apart from the image of you finishing the service in your mankini. That is.
How did you know?
I don't believe it. I think people might take away with them. Literally, in your case, yes, literally, take it away with them. So yeah, fantastic. because I just think that's just a real refreshing challenge to people to say, yeah, these are great words, and people go, yeah, these are great words, aren't they? And it's okay, let's do it then now. Let's just do it now. People go, what? No, not now. I need to go and plan this and maybe buy an extra coat just because I'll need my coat, won't I? But that's just the point, isn't it? Do it now spontaneously. Although you wouldn't be doing it spontaneously, but that'd be very powerful. I shall look forward to what the fallout is from that's absolutely fantastic. So, any other ideas before? I've got a couple of ideas, but I haven't really fully thought them through. One of the phrases that stuck in my head was just the very beginning of Genesis. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers couldn't answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. Yeah. I thought, what a devastating line. They haven't seen him for years, and they finally see him, and they're dismayed at his presence. And I just wonder whether there's a way to tap into that in people's lives, that whether there are times when you genuinely felt people are dismayed by your presence, and what does that make you feel? Rejected, pushed away, not wanted. They literally wish he was dead, I think, is what's going on here, isn't it? They probably thought he was dead. Unless the dismay is about, oh, now we're going to have to answer for it. But I kind of think, we thought we'd dealt with that problem, and here he is again. People may well have that experience in their lives. I don't know, but I don't know how you'd actually approach that sensitively with the congregation. The other thing I thought was, I think probably I had in my head, Lythan's idea is probably better than mine. But I had in my head this idea of people thinking through how they maybe need to respond to this stuff about enemies. In my experience, people don't generally have enemies who they'd actually call an enemy. It sounds like it's like a really strong word, isn't it? But they do have people who wind them up, and people who they choose to avoid, people who they sigh whenever the phone goes. And you wouldn't call them enemies, would you? But we all know what we're talking about. How do we begin to deal with that without saying, let's do it instantly now with this piece of paper that we're going to burn or something? And I wondered about sort the logistics out yourself, because you're all clever than me. But I had the image in my head of breaking ice, largely because it was cold this week, and I had to go down and break the chickens' ice on their water several times. Whether there's any way you could get like a big tray with ice in it, and invite people just to come and tap it with a little hammer and just break the ice. You haven't dealt with it, but you've broken. No, but that's where the phrase comes from, breaking the ice, doesn't it? How can you somehow break the ice with a difficult relationship you're involved in? You'd need maybe a big church freezer or something, and a tray with water on. Then you've got a big sheet of ice on a tray, and people can just come and tap it, and then think as they tap it about what relationship they need to break the ice with a bit. Not to say that it's done then, it's just the ice is broken and there's an opportunity to make a change. But whether that works or not, the other thing I had in my head was, if you can't manage, I'll with you in a minute, listen, if you can't manage a big sheet of ice, I wondered how practical it is to actually give people a chunk of an ice cube. That would be easier to arrange, and to get them to hold it in their hand. It's quite uncomfortable to hold an ice cube, and to suggest that sort of holding on to these enmities is a painful thing in our lives, and it slowly melts as you deal with it and hold on to it. So I wonder whether you might try something with ice cubes, and get people to hold ice cubes as they pray or as they think. You're going to get wet. People are going to get wet.
If you want me to attend, Phil, I've just completed my first aid in the workplace renewal, and I have a 3-year certificate to treat the frostbite that you'll be causing.
Is it dangerous holding an ice cube? Probably is. So we'll invite Pete around with whatever you need to treat ice cube burns. Yeah, Lythan.
I liked your big thing of ice idea. I was thinking, the first time someone's done a big Once it's broken, it's broken. But I thought maybe because it's the chipping away, and that if you ask people to take it in turns, or if you've got any children around, that's the sort of thing they'd love to do, and kind of count how many chips it takes for it to break. And again, that's kind of just saying that all of this is a process. And almost maybe as long as Joseph's processes of his life, if some of those things hadn't happened to Joseph, would he have been able to forgive his brothers when he actually sees them, or would he still have held the resentment of what they'd done had caused his life to be? And I just think that chipping away bit would be a really good illustration if you can figure out how to have your big piece of ice to start with.
Oh, you just need to hire one of those ice sculpture people to bring a giant block in on Sunday morning, don't you, and put it on the flower stand, and then people can chip away to their heart's content. And then you can answer to the property committee afterwards as to your ruined soaked carpets or whatever you end up with. Anyway, yeah, sort out the details yourselves. That's not our job. We just fish for big ideas, and you have to sort out the practicalities. Robert?
I just thought you could use toffee. Big sheet of toffee, and then they could hit it. Like a toffee you get with the hammer.
I suppose you could, except
and they could eat
nice
it.
Thing. Toffee's nice, whereas ice is sort of cold and. Yeah, a toffee hammer. There is such thing as a toffee hammer, isn't there? Where would you get a big sheet of toffee from, though, Robert? Right.
Somebody could make it.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah. Ice or toffee, and a toffee hammer, or a block of ice, or a cube of ice with appropriate medical St. John's ambulance on standby. Then that works. Yeah. I think we've probably chipped away all of the stuff we're going to glean from these passages. Just for those who still might be puzzled, Lytton's reference to Sermon on the Plain is Plain, just in case anybody's still wondering how on earth there was a Sermon on the Plain in Jesus' day. We've been talking absolute worship. And we hope that maybe one thing that we have said has set you off in a direction that helps you to bring these passages to life for your congregation. We'll all be doing that in our own churches, and to help us as we carry on with our preparation, I'm going to ask Peter to pray with us.
Okay, let's pray. Lord, as we have chatted through these passages, so many different ideas and creative ideas as to how we may use them, but also an awareness of the difficulty and the real challenge that lies within them. So we ask that you be with us in our preparation and prepare the hearts and the minds of those that we will share with. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.